You are standing on a ridge overlooking the Argus River, and the first thing you notice isn't the cold, though the biting mountain wind of the Carpathian Range is currently slicing through your wool tunic. It isn't the sound of the water crashing against the rocks below. The first thing you notice is the smell. It is a thick, cloying sweetness that sticks to the back of your throat, a mixture of rot, pine resin, and iron. You try to breathe through your mouth, but the taste is even worse. You look up, and that is when you see them. A forest that was never planted by nature. Thousands of wooden stakes, bleached white by the sun and stained dark by what has leaked down their lengths, rise from the valley floor. The shapes atop them don't look like people anymore. They look like ragged dolls, frozen in a state of impossible vertical agony. You see a woman. She is positioned at the very edge of the path, her body tilted at an angle that suggests the wood has bypassed every vital organ just to keep her pulse fluttering for as long as humanly possible. Her eyes are open, but the crows have already begun their work. This is not just an execution. This is a message. This is a landscape redesigned to reflect the mind of one man. You realize then that the stories you heard in the safety of the village were not exaggerations. If anything, they were sanitized. Because what the official chronicles tell you is a story of a stern but fair defender of Christendom. But standing here, in the shadow of the impaled, you realize the truth is something much darker, something the history books were too terrified to fully record. Wallachia, the year 1462. The most terrifying part of this scene isn't the scale of the cruelty. It isn't even the sight of the thousands of bodies swaying in the breeze. The most terrifying part is the intentionality. Every stake is a specific height. Every victim is placed according to a hierarchy of pain. This wasn't a moment of blind rage or a fluke of medieval warfare. This was a calculated system of psychological management. We are talking about Vlad the Third, known to the world as Dracula, the son of the dragon. But while the legends focus on his battles with the Ottoman Empire or his thirst for blood, there is a specific chapter of his reign that remains shrouded in whispers. A chapter involving the women of his realm that goes far beyond simple casualty of war. It was a systematic campaign of terror designed to reshape the very fabric of society. Before we dive deeper into the darkness of the forest of the impaled and the secrets hidden in the old manuscripts, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. By joining us, you help uncover the hidden machinery of history that the official stories often try to bury. Now, think about the logic of the world Vlad inhabited. To understand why he did what he did to the women of Wallachia, you have to understand the machine he was born into. You see, Vlad wasn't just a madman in a vacuum. He was a product of a borderland. Wallachia was a tiny principality caught in a cosmic vice. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, an unstoppable superpower that was systematically dismantling the old world. To the north and west, the Kingdom of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire. Powers that promised protection, but usually delivered only betrayal. This was a land where loyalty was a currency that devalued by the hour. A land where a prince's life expectancy was often measured in months, not years. To survive in this environment, you couldn't just be a ruler. You had to be a force of nature. You had to be more terrifying than the ghosts in the woods and more predictable than the law. Vlad's entire philosophy of governance was built on one word: order. But his definition of order was something that would make a modern mind recoil in horror. He believed that the state was a body, and any part of that body that was unproductive or unvirtuous had to be cut away with a hot iron. But here's the thing. While we often view the medieval world as a lawless free-for-all, Vlad's Wallachia was actually a place of terrifyingly strict bureaucracy. The system of power was rooted in the boyars, the landowning nobility who had spent centuries playing princes against each other to keep their own pockets full. They were the ones who had betrayed Vlad's father and buried his older brother alive. When Vlad took the throne for his second reign in 1456, he didn't just see a kingdom to lead. He saw a crime scene that needed to be cleaned. He looked at the boyars, and he saw corruption. He looked at the merchants, and he saw greed. But when he looked at the women of his realm, he saw something else entirely. He saw the ultimate litmus test for his total control over the private lives of his subjects. In the eyes of Vlad the Impaler, a woman's virtue was not a private matter. It was a matter of state security. If a woman was unfaithful, if she was lazy, or if she dishonored her family, She wasn't just a sinner in the eyes of the church. She was a glitch in his perfect machine. And the way he chose to fix those glitches remains one of the most brutal, suppressed chapters in human history. Now watch what happens next. To understand the why behind the brutality, you have to look at the economic reality of the 15th century. Wallachia was poor. It was a transit zone for trade, and the only way for a prince to build an army capable of holding off the Sultan was to ensure every single person in the principality was contributing to the collective defense. Idleness was seen as a form of treason. This applied to everyone, from the highest-ranking noblewoman to the lowest peasant. Imagine the scene in a small village near Tirgovista. A woman is found by Vlad's inspectors to have a husband whose shirt is torn or dirty. In any other kingdom, this is a domestic non-issue. In Vlad's Wallachia, this is a systemic failure. If the wife cannot keep her husband's clothes clean, the husband is less effective as a laborer or a soldier. If he is less effective, the state is weaker. If the state is weaker, the Turks win. Therefore, the woman has committed a crime against the survival of the nation. Historians debate the exact numbers, but the accounts suggest that Vlad would have these women brought before him. He didn't just find them. He didn't put them in a pillory. He applied the same logic of the stake to them as he did to captured enemy generals. The punishment had to be so visible, so agonizingly public, that no woman in Wallachia would ever dare to be unproductive again. He was using the bodies of his own female subjects as billboards for his brand of absolute, draconian morality. Think about the logic for a moment. If you can control what happens inside a person's home, if you can make them fear you more than they fear death itself while they are performing the simplest household chores, then you have achieved a level of power that no king in the West could even dream of. You have moved beyond being a political leader. You have become the ultimate patriarch, the arbiter of life, death, and the very definition of womanhood. But the official story, the one written by the Saxons of Transylvania who hated him, or the Russian chronicles that praised his firm hand, often skips over the specifics of these encounters. They focus on the impalements of the thousands of Turkish prisoners at the Forest of the Dead, because that fits the narrative of a holy war. They talk about the 200 boyars he invited to a feast, only to have them all impaled while they were still digesting their meal. But the quiet, intimate horror he visited upon the women of his own land tells us more about the true nature of his regime than any battlefield victory ever could. The mechanism of his power wasn't just the stake. It was the complete erasure of the boundary between the public and the private. In his mind, there was no such thing as a private life. Every action, every word, and every heartbeat belonged to the prince. And if you failed to live up to his impossible standard of a perfect subject, the machine would consume you. And that is where the real horror begins. Because as we move deeper into the records, we find that Vlad's interest in the behavior of women wasn't just about productivity. It was about a deep-seated, almost pathological obsession with purity and the perceived deception of the female form. This wasn't just about messy houses or torn shirts. It was about what happened when a woman tried to exert any form of agency over her own body. In the 1500s, a pamphlet was circulated in Nuremberg that described Vlad encountering a woman who had been unfaithful to her husband. The description of what he did to her is so extreme that for centuries, historians dismissed it as mere propaganda. They claimed it was a fabrication by his enemies to make him look like a monster. But as we cross-reference these accounts with the legal codes of the time and the archaeological evidence of mass graves in the region, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that suggests the propaganda might have actually been an understatement. You have to realize that in the 15th century, information was the most valuable weapon. Vlad knew that his enemies were watching. He knew that the story of his reign would be told by those who survived it. And yet, he didn't hide his actions. He leaned into them. He invited foreign ambassadors to dine among the steaks. He wanted the world to see what he was capable of. But the story of what he did to the women was different. That wasn't for the foreign ambassadors. That was for his people. That was the internal engine of his terror. But before you can understand the full extent of the hidden story promised in the title, we have to look at the legal and religious mechanisms that allowed this to happen. This wasn't just one man's whim. It was supported by a specific interpretation of Orthodox Christianity and the Zakonic, or the old Slavic codes of law. Vlad saw himself as the hand of God on earth. If God punished the wicked with eternal fire, Vlad would punish them with immediate wood. The church at the time was a partner in this. They provided the moral framework that justified the purification of the social order. They preached that a woman's primary duty was submission and labor. When Vlad enforced this with the stake, he was, in his mind, merely accelerating the divine justice that was already written in the scriptures. It was a perfect closed loop of authority. The prince provided the force, the church provided the justification, and the people provided the victims. But even within this system of total control, there were things that Vlad did that shocked even his most loyal supporters. Things that were so brutal they were omitted from the official court records of the Draculesti family. They were too much for the official story. They were the kind of acts that turn a historical figure into a folk demon. As we move into the next phase of this journey, we have to look at the specifics. We have to look at the names that were almost erased. We have to look at the hidden logic of why Vlad targeted certain women with a ferocity that seemed to exceed even his hatred for the invading Ottomans. Because the most terrifying thing about Vlad the Impaler isn't that he was a monster. It's that he was a man who believed with every fiber of his being that he was the only hero left in a world gone mad. And to save that world, he believed he had to break every woman in it. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of a cart rolling over uneven cobblestones. It is the autumn of 1459 in the city of Târgoviște. The air is crisp, smelling of wood smoke and slaughtered livestock. You are a merchant's wife, standing in the doorway of your home, watching a procession of the prince's men. They aren't looking for rebels today. They aren't looking for Ottoman spies. They are looking at the state of the door frames. They are looking at the cleanliness of the children's faces. They are looking at you. In Vlad's Wallachia, the home was not a sanctuary. It was a factory, and you were its manager. If the output of that factory, the health of the workers and the maintenance of the tools, was found wanting, the manager was held liable. There is a famous account, recorded in the Slavic chronicles, of Vlad encountering a peasant man working in the fields. The man's tunic was short, ragged, and dirty. Vlad didn't ask the man why he was poor. He didn't ask if the harvest had been bad. He asked the man if he had a wife. When the man replied that he did, Vlad had the woman brought before him immediately. Now, think about the logic here. In any other medieval court, this would be a trivial interaction, perhaps a small fine, or a lecture on pride. But Vlad looked at this woman and saw a biological failure. He told her that her husband's labor was the bedrock of the country's defense, and by failing to provide him with a clean, whole tunic, she was sabotaging the state. He didn't just scold her, he had her hands cut off and then had her impaled. The most terrifying part isn't the violence itself. It's the reason he gave. He claimed he was doing her a favor. He was relieving her of the burden of a life she was clearly too lazy to lead. He then forced the peasant man to marry another woman, with a warning. If the second wife was as lazy as the first, she would meet the same fate. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a management strategy. By turning every domestic failure into a capital offense, Vlad turned every household into a miniature police state. The husband became the informant, the wife became the prisoner, and the prince became the ultimate judge of quality control. But here is where the official story begins to thin, and the true darkness starts to bleed through the pages. While the tales of the lazy wife were often shared as grim parables of Vlad's fairness, the reality of his campaign against women was much more pervasive and focused on a specific type of social engineering. He was obsessed with the concept of the dishonest woman. To understand this, you have to look at the historian's lens of the 15th century. Population was power. In a land decimated by constant warfare with the Turks and the Hungarians, every womb was a strategic asset. A child was a future soldier or a future laborer. Therefore, any woman who stepped outside the strict, state-sanctioned boundaries of marriage was seen as a thief. She was stealing potential resources from the crown. If a woman was found to have committed adultery, or if a widow was found to be unchaste, Vlad's response was designed to be a literal deconstruction of the female identity. The accounts from the Saxon merchants, who, it must be noted, were his political rivals, but whose descriptions of his legal methods often match the internal logic of his reign, describe a series of punishments that were specifically designed to target a woman's dignity. He didn't just want them dead. He wanted them to be a spectacle. He would often have women's breasts cut off or their skin flayed before they were ever put on the stake. But there was a chilling precision to it. He would frequently order that the stake be driven through the woman's vagina until it emerged from her mouth. This wasn't random gore. This was a symbolic reclaiming of the body by the state. He was saying, in the most graphic language possible, that if a woman used her body in a way the prince did not approve of, the prince would use that body to send a message to every other woman in the principality. Now, watch what happens next. You might think that this level of brutality would lead to an immediate uprising. You might think the people would eventually tire of the blood. But here is the thing about terror. When it is applied with total consistency, it creates a strange, twisted form of security. Chroniclers of the time wrote that during Vlad's reign, you could leave a golden cup at a public fountain in the middle of the capital, and it would still be there a month later. No one dared to touch it. But that security was built on the backs of women who lived in a state of constant low-grade electricity. Every interaction was a potential death sentence. If you were a young woman in Wallachia, you weren't just worried about the Turks coming over the horizon. You were worried about the neighbor who didn't like your family. You were worried about a disgruntled suitor making a false accusation of dishonesty to the prince's inspectors. Because under Vlad, the accusation was often the conviction. There was no due process as we understand it. There was only the prince's instinct. And this leads us to the most debated part of the official story, the case of the pregnant mistress. The story goes that Vlad had a mistress who, in an attempt to please him, or perhaps to secure her own position, told him she was pregnant. Vlad, ever the skeptic and obsessed with truth, allegedly told her that he did not believe her. When she insisted, he didn't call for a midwife. He didn't wait for time to prove her right or wrong. He took a knife and opened her up himself to see where the truth lay. Historians have gone back and forth on this account for 6 centuries. Some say it is a fabrication intended to paint him as an antichrist. Others point to the fact that similar stories appear in multiple, independent sources across different languages. But whether the specific event happened exactly as described is almost secondary to the why. Think about the logic of the narrative. Even if it is a legend that grew in a soil fertilized by real, documented atrocities. It reflects a man who viewed the female body not as a human being, but as a vessel of information. If that vessel was suspected of carrying a lie, it had to be broken open. This is the hidden mechanism of Vlad's power. He used the protection of morality as a cloak for total systemic domination. He wasn't just a hard ruler. He was an architect of a society where the most intimate parts of human existence, love, sex, and childbirth, were property of the throne. But wait, because the escalation doesn't stop with individual crimes. To truly understand what Vlad did to the women of Wallachia, you have to look at his cleansing of the social classes. In 1459, the same year as the great impalements of the merchants, Vlad turned his attention to the unproductive elements of the capital. He issued an invitation to all the poor, the sick, the lame, and the loose women of the city. He promised them a great feast at a large hall in Târgoviște. Imagine the scene. These women, many of whom had lived on the fringes of society, perhaps selling what they had to survive in a war-torn world, thought they were finally receiving the prince's mercy. They were fed. They were given wine. They were told that the prince wanted to end their suffering. And then, as the meal concluded, Vlad's men exited the hall and locked the doors from the outside. He set the building on fire. As the flames rose, Vlad reportedly watched from a distance, explaining to his court that he had done these women a service. He had purified the city. He had ensured that they would never be hungry or cold again. And he had removed the stain they placed on the reputation of his capital. This wasn't an act of war. It was an act of urban renewal through mass murder. The official story often frames Vlad as a defender of his people. And in a narrow military sense, he was. He fought the Ottomans with a brilliance and a ruthlessness that terrified the Sultan himself. But the price of that protection was the total surrender of the self. For the women of Wallachia, the son of the dragon wasn't a hero guarding the gates. He was the monster inside the house. But why did he specifically target women in these ways? Why the focus on purity and domestic duty? To find the answer, we have to look deeper into Vlad's own childhood. We have to look at his time as a hostage in the Ottoman court, where he witnessed a different kind of power and a different way of treating those deemed inferior. He took those lessons and twisted them with his own brand of orthodox zealotry to create something the world had never seen. And as we move into the next chapter of this story, we will see how this system of terror eventually backfired. Because you can only break so many people before the very fabric of the society you are trying to save begins to unravel. We will look at the specific legal documents that survived his reign, the Black Books, and what they reveal about the women who tried to fight back against the machine. Now, consider the logistics of what I am about to describe next, because the most brutal part of the story isn't the fire or the stake. It's what happened when the prince's order met the reality of human emotion. It's what happened when the logic of the state met the one thing Vlad could never truly control: the spirit of those he sought to erase. Now let us look at the historian's lens to understand the infrastructure of this fear. We often imagine Vlad the Impaler acting alone, a solitary figure in a dark cape silhouetted against a bloody moon. But power on this scale requires a system. It requires a bureaucracy of terror. To manage the purity of the women of Wallachia, Vlad utilized a network of local informants and low-level officials known as armasi. These were the prince's enforcers, the men who carried the stakes and the hammers. But more importantly, they were the ones who carried the ledgers. Think about the logic of the ledger. In the 1500s, several accounts referenced what have been called the Black Books of the Draculesti. These weren't books of magic. They were records of perceived moral debts. In these pages, the lives of common women were reduced to binary codes: virtuous or unvirtuous, productive or idle. If an armasi entered a village and found a woman whose reputation was whispered about by the local priest, her name went into the book. Once your name was in the book, the machinery of the state began to grind toward you. But here is the pivot. The most terrifying part isn't that Vlad was obsessed with punishing sin. It's that he used these punishments to solve a very specific political problem: the loyalty of the peasantry. By positioning himself as the ultimate guardian of traditional values, he bypassed the local boyars. He told the common man, "I am the only one who cares if your wife is faithful. I am the only one who cares if your household is clean." He was building a direct, terrifying bond with the patriarchs of every small farm, using the bodies of their wives and daughters as the collateral for that loyalty. On the 10th of April, 1460, an event occurred in the outskirts of Brasov that perfectly illustrates the systemic nature of this horror. Vlad wasn't just at war with the people. He was at war with the very idea of mercy. He had captured a group of merchant families. Among them were women of high standing, educated and wealthy. In any other medieval conflict, these women would have been held for a massive ransom. They were worth thousands of gold ducats. They were the liquid assets of the 15th century nobility. But Vlad didn't want the money. He wanted to prove that his system was blind to class. He ordered that the women be dressed in their finest silks and jewels. He had them seated at a banquet table in the middle of a field. And then, he had the stakes brought out. He didn't just impale them. He had them impaled in a circle around the table so that as they died, they were forced to look at the luxury they were leaving behind. He was making a point to the rising merchant class. Your gold cannot buy a different set of rules. In my land, the only currency is obedience. Now, watch what happens next. This obsession with correcting women reached a fever pitch during his campaigns against the Saxon settlers. These were German-speaking people who lived in the fortified cities of Transylvania. Vlad viewed their women as particularly dangerous because they were often more independent than the women of the Wallachian countryside. They managed businesses. They held property rights. To Vlad, this was an affront to the natural order he was trying to impose. When he raided these cities, his men were given specific instructions. They weren't just to loot, they were to re-educate. Accounts from the time suggest that Vlad oversaw the public humiliation of these women on a scale that felt like a ritual. He would have them stripped and marched through the streets before being subjected to the punishment of the fire. But the most chilling detail: he often forced their children to watch. He believed that by witnessing the destruction of the unvirtuous mother, the next generation would be successfully broken into his way of thinking. And that is when you realize the true goal. This wasn't just about sadism. It was about long-term stability. If you can traumatize a child deeply enough by showing them what happens to a woman who steps out of line, you don't need to station a soldier in that village 20 years later. The memory does the work for you. Historians debate the impact of these moral purges. Some argue that they actually worked in the short term, creating a society that was so paralyzed by fear that crime virtually vanished. But others point to the hidden cost. By targeting women, the primary caregivers and the connectors of the community, Vlad was effectively shredding the social fabric of his own country. He was creating a nation of individuals who were too afraid to trust their own mothers, wives, or sisters. Think about the logic of a world where trust is a death sentence. If your wife hides a piece of bread for a starving neighbor, and you don't report her, you are both impaled. If your daughter is seen talking to a traveler, and you don't inform the armasi, your entire household is burned. This is the hidden story that the official chronicles of the great Christian defender don't want to tell. They want to talk about the night attack at Tirgoviste, where Vlad nearly killed the Sultan. They don't want to talk about the thousands of silent domestic night attacks he carried out against the women of his own villages. But there is a specific revelation building here. You see, there was one group of women that Vlad feared more than any other. They weren't the lazy wives or the unchaste widows. They were the mos, the traditional midwives and healers. In the medieval Balkans, these women were the keepers of secrets. They knew who was pregnant, they knew who was sick, and they knew the lineage of every family. They held a form of power that was ancient, decentralized, and entirely outside the prince's control. And so, Vlad began a quiet campaign to eliminate them. He didn't call it a witch hunt. That was a Western European term. He called it a cleansing of the spirit. He accused these women of using herbs and old ways to help women deceive their husbands and their prince. By removing the midwives, he was ensuring that the state was the only authority on life and death. He wanted to be the one who decided which children were fit to be born and which women were fit to raise them. But here's the thing about the official story. It likes to pretend that everyone submitted. It likes to pretend that Vlad was an all-knowing, all-powerful shadow that no one dared to cross. But the deeper you look into the black books and the local folklore that survived in the mountain villages, you find something else. You find hints of a resistance. You find stories of women who smuggled their daughters across the border to the Hungarian mountains. You find records of accidental fires in the armories that happened just after a local woman had been taken to the stakes. Even the most terrifying system has cracks. And Vlad's obsession with controlling women was perhaps his greatest weakness. Because while he was busy watching the households of his peasants, his enemies were watching him. They saw that his cruelty was making him unstable in the eyes of the other Christian kings. They saw that his logic was becoming so extreme that it was no longer useful to the broader war effort against the Turks. On the 26th of November, 1462, the machine finally stalled. Vlad was forced to flee his fortress at Poenari as the Ottoman army, led by his own brother, Radu the Handsome, closed in. And here is where the story takes a final, chilling turn regarding the women in his life. The official story says his wife threw herself from the castle towers into the Argas River to avoid capture by the Turks. It is framed as a tragic act of loyalty and sacrifice. But look at the historian's lens. Is it sacrifice? Or is it the ultimate escape from a man whose love was as sharp as a stake? When you are married to the son of the dragon, perhaps the cold embrace of the river is the only place left where the prince cannot reach you. As we move into the final block, we are going to look at the aftermath. We are going to look at the pattern that Vlad left behind. A blueprint for how power uses the bodies of the vulnerable to send a message to the world. And we will finally reveal the single most important secret that the official history tried to erase. What happened to the women who survived the forest of the dead, and how their silence shaped the Europe we know today. Now think about the logic of what comes next. Because the end of Vlad the Impaler wasn't the end of his system. It was just the beginning of its transformation into a legend. The end of the reign of Vlad the Third was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, cold realization that the world had moved beyond his particular brand of nightmare. By the time he was captured by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, in late 1462, the forest of the impaled had become more than a military tactic. It had become a liability, but the most important revelation isn't found in his battles or his imprisonment. It is found in the way his story was cleaned for the monarchs of Europe. You see, for years, historians wondered why the stories of his brutality toward women, the stories of the black books, the midwives, and the lazy wives, were tucked away into obscure pamphlets, while his war with the Sultan was shouted from the rooftops. The central revelation is this: the official story was sanitized not to protect Vlad's reputation, but to protect the mechanism of his power. The monarchs of the 15th century realized that while Vlad was a monster, his method of using domestic morality as a weapon of state control was actually a stroke of dark genius. They didn't want to condemn the tactic, they wanted to inherit it. The secret that was erased from the official history is that Vlad's moral purges weren't just the acts of a madman. They were a pilot program for the modern surveillance state. By making a woman's virtue and productivity a matter of national security, he created a template where the government could enter the bedroom and the kitchen with a legal warrant. After his death, you see these same patterns: the policing of domesticity, the state-sponsored moral inspections, emerge in the legal codes of the very empires that claimed to find him repulsive. The official story made him a vampire to ensure we wouldn't see him as a pioneer. But what happened to the survivors? What happened to the women who lived through the year 1462? The aftermath was a landscape of silence. In the decades following Vlad's death, Wallachia didn't suddenly become a paradise. The trauma was baked into the architecture of the villages. Historians note a strange shift in the folk songs and oral traditions of the region from that era. The songs became quieter. The stories became more about the walls having ears. The women who survived the cleansing of the midwives passed down a new kind of knowledge, the knowledge of how to be invisible. They learned that to survive under a system like Vlad's, you must never be notable. You must never be the one the prince notices. This is the repeating blueprint of power. From the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries to the authoritarian regimes of the 20th, the playbook remains the same. You identify a vulnerable group, often women, and you frame their private behavior as a threat to the public good. You use purity as a justification for control. You turn neighbors into informants and husbands into wardens. Vlad the Impaler was simply the first to do it with such terrifying vertical transparency. As we look back from the 21st century, it is easy to dismiss Dracula as a relic of a primitive age. But if you look closely at the way modern systems still attempt to legislating the female body and police domestic roles, you realize the stake is still there. It's just been polished. It's been hidden behind legal jargon and social pressure. The forest of the impaled didn't disappear. It just became a metaphor for the way society still uses shame to manage those it cannot fully control. Before we conclude this journey into the dark heart of Wallachia, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Does the official story of Vlad the Defender hold up when you look at what he did to his own people? Or was he simply a man who realized that the easiest way to control a nation is to start with the women? Think about the logic one last time. If history is written by the victors, then the official story is always a construction. It is a wall built to hide the mass graves of those who didn't fit the narrative. When we dig into the stories of the unproductive and the unvirtuous, we aren't just looking at the victims of a tyrant. We are looking at the people who are too human for the machine. Vlad the Third was killed in late 1476, his head allegedly sent to Constantinople as a trophy. His body was buried, according to legend, in an unmarked grave so that he could never be found. But the system he built, the system of morality through terror, was never truly buried. It was adopted. It was refined. And it continues to haunt the way we think about power, gender, and the cost of order. If you want to see more deep dives into the suppressed mechanisms of history's most terrifying regimes, click on the video on your screen now. There are many more stories that the official records would rather you forget. And that is what really happened.